Chapter 4. The Music Box. Later that evening, the sounds of the supper bell were still echoing through the halls as 24 girls filed silently into the dining hall through the door on the west side. At the same time, 18 boys were filing quietly in from the east end. All 42 young people took their places around the tables without speaking. They stood, each behind his or own chair, and waiting for the prayer. The chipmunk was nearly finished. Jed had spent most of the afternoon down in the secluded little glen below the playground, and as he carved he watched and hoped for Henry's appearance, but his new friend never returned. Jed had already decided that the carving, when it was completed, would go to Henry. Miss Agatha raised her voice. "Let us return thanks." She bowed her head and recited a formal prayer from memory. As soon as the prayer was ended, the students slid their chairs out and dropped into them. "Summer is just like lunch," Henry, who was seated at the next table, told Jed. "When it's your table's turn, you carry your plate through the serving line, and Mr. Matthew puts the food on your plate." Jed nodded. He glanced around the dining hall, trying to spot Mandy. He saw her seated all alone at the last table. Her head was down, and she was crying bitterly. The other girls at her table were already going through the serving line, but Mandy was still seated at the table, crying as if her heart was breaking. Jed heard and sighed. Before he knew what he was doing, he had slipped across the dining hall and leaned over her. He embraced her in a tight hug. "Mandy, what's wrong?" They took my music box," Mandy sobbed. "Who took it?" Miss Agatha. She said she's not going to give it back for a long time. Oh, Jed, what will I do without my music box? And the other girls are so unfriendly, and I don't like it here, and I don't have any friends." She looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. "Oh, Jed, why did we have to come here? I want to go home." Jed blinked back his own tears as he hugged her again. "It's going to be all right, Mandy," he tried to reassure her. You'll make friends, and you'll learn to—" Whack! The blow across the side of the head nearly knocked Jed to the floor. He staggered backwards, clutching his head with both hands. He looked up to see an angry Miss Madeline towering over him. "Mr. Barrett," she growled, "apparently you don't take the rules seriously. Boys never—" She stopped and stabbed him in the chest with a big finger. "Never are allowed on the girls' side of the dining hall." Her eyes were filled with rage, and she was so angry that her lips were trembling. "Now get back on the boys' side, or I will thrash you soundly right here in front of everybody." Jed fled to his table. Why does she have to be so cruel? He raged inwardly as he took a seat. "Mandy needs me. She's crying her heart out. But that big bully, Miss Madeline, won't even let me talk to her." He clenched his fists, not caring that the other boys at the table were all staring at him. When supper was finished, Jed carried his plate back to the serving line and placed it on the counter as the other students were doing. Seeing a teacher standing to one side supervising, he walked over to her. "What do we do now, ma'am?" "The next 2 hours are for study and schoolwork," the woman told him pleasantly. "You may work in your room or in the library, but no one is allowed outside except to use the outhouse. You must ask permission to do that." "I haven't been to class yet, so I don't have any class work," he told her. "May I go to the library and read?" She smiled at him. "Of course." Jed was delighted to find that the library, a large, pleasant room with many windows on the first floor, was well stocked with books. All 4 walls had shelves from floor to ceiling, and there were very few empty places on the shelves. There were 4 additional rows of bookshelves in the center of the room. At one end of the library, 6 desks placed side by side provided a place for students to work or read. The ecstatic boy eagerly chose a book from one of the shelves and seated himself at an empty desk to read. "This is the best thing about this place," he told himself. Contentedly glancing across the rows of shelves heavily laden with books, Jed began to read. "It will take me a long time to read all these." He felt a pang in his heart as he thought about Mandy. "She looks so unhappy," he thought sadly. "I hope she makes friends and gets over her fears. If only I could talk with her and try to encourage her." He sighed deeply. "Oh, why can't Miss Madeline and Miss Agatha see how much we need to be together? Mandy needs me, and I need her. I think that Henry is going to be a good friend. But I sure miss Ma and Pa, and I wish that they would let Mandy and me spend time together." Jed thought about Wolf. "Mister, you better take good care of my dog," he whispered fiercely, as if he were face to face with Rad Baylor. "If you're mean to him and I find out about it, you're going to have to answer to me." He swallowed a lump in his throat. "I wish I had Wolf here with me tonight." Jed spent the next 2 hours reading a delightful book about kings and queens and dragons and treasure. The story took him in his imagination to a faraway place, a mystical land far from Charity home. Pa had often told stories of kings and queens and castles, of knights and dragons, and the book reminded Jed of Pa's tales. For a time his troubles were momentarily forgotten. He was more than halfway through the book when his attention was arrested by a boy lighting the various lamps around the library. He was surprised to see that it was Henry. "Henry," he whispered, waving his hand to get his friend's attention. "Over here." The boy hurried over. "We're not allowed to talk in the library," he warned in a low voice. "If Miss Madeline or Miss Agatha catches us, we're in serious trouble." Jed nodded to show that he understood. "Sorry," he whispered. "I wasn't trying to get you in trouble. Can you meet me below the playground again tomorrow? I have something to show you." Henry nodded and busied himself with the lighting of the lamps. Jed went back to his reading. Mandy sat on her bunk with her back against the wall, silently watching the other girls as they did their schoolwork. 2 of the girls were lying side by side on their bellies on the large braided rug in the center of the room, while the other 3 were all perched like little birds on the top bunk across the room. Mandy suddenly felt extremely lonely. She had been introduced to each of the girls, and they had each seemed polite enough, but not one of them had offered to be her friend. She sighed. "Oh, if only I had just one friend. A friend would cheer me up, and then this horrid place would not seem quite so lonely." She thought about the music box. "How long will that horrid Miss Agatha keep it? Will she ever get it back?" A troubling thought occurred to her just then, and she gasped in dismay. "What if Miss Agatha decides to keep it forever and ever? What will I do if I never get it back? Oh dear, I don't think I can stand such a terrible thought." The tears threatened to well up again, so she deliberately turned her thoughts to other matters.